Ever get that sinking feeling? You know, that feeling when someone you trusted turns out to be, well, not who you thought they were.
Mm-mm.
Someone in a position of authority, especially.
Oh,
And that's
yes.
exactly what we're diving into today, like straight into the deep end.
Head first.
Yeah, with this Jeffrey Maddrey case in the NYPD, this whole thing, it's like something you'd see on TV, ripped right from the headlines.
It really is. And I think for a lot of folks out there, it really gets them thinking, right? Like, here's Maddrey, the highest ranking uniformed officer in the entire NYPD, and bam, suddenly he resigns.
Just like that.
Yeah, amidst all these allegations about this sex for OT scheme with a lieutenant under his command, Quathisha Epps.
And it's not just the scandal of it all, although let's be honest, that's definitely attention grabbing.
Right.
But what really gets me is the bigger question here. If the people we're supposed to trust, the ones who are supposed to keep us safe, if they're potentially abusing their power like this,
Hmm.
then
Where does that leave us, right?
yeah,
Who can we trust?
exactly. And that's what I think makes this whole thing so unsettling. It really chips away at that foundation of trust we have in these institutions, especially law enforcement.
I mean, we expect them to uphold the law, not to be out there exploiting it for personal gain.
Right. So let's break down what actually happened here, step by step. From what I gathered, the initial reports, they all focused on this Lieutenant Epps and how she was getting a crazy amount of overtime, like her salary was boosted significantly, all seemingly because Maddrey was authorizing it.
And we're not talking about small amounts here. It's tens of thousands of taxpayer dollars, potentially misused.
Yeah, so not exactly chump change. And you have to think about the system itself, right? I mean, in the NYPD, overtime usually gets approved through a whole chain of command.
Yeah, with all these safeguards in place, theoretically, to prevent abuse. So was there a failure in the system somewhere? Was someone pressured to approve these overtime requests, even though they maybe shouldn't have been?
These are the kinds of things investigators are going to need to dig into.
They've got their work cut out for them, for sure.
Yeah, because if those checks and balances just totally failed, then this isn't just some isolated incident. It's a symptom of a much bigger problem.
Potentially a systemic issue.
And then to make things even more complicated, you have those reports that came out about Maddrey's wife confronting him about all this, and then bam, a very public, very messy separation.
It's almost like a soap opera, but it also shows you the real-world consequences, right? Behind the headlines, there are real people whose lives are being turned upside down.
Families torn apart, reputations shattered. Yeah, it's not just some abstract news story. And then, out of the blue, Maddrey resigns. Just like that.
Gone.
And the NYPD didn't waste any time accepting that resignation. It's almost like they wanted it all to go away as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and that makes you wonder, does that make them look more or less guilty, right? Did they prioritize making the scandal disappear over actually getting to the bottom of what happened? I mean, sometimes acting too quickly can backfire.
You've got a point there. But wait, there's more. Maddrey, speaking through his attorney, is now saying the whole relationship with Epps was consensual, and he's actually accusing her of defamation.
Whoa, hold on. So a complete 180.
Yeah, he's saying she's lying about him to hurt his reputation. And to prove it, his attorney released what he says are communications, like texts or emails, all initiated by Epps.
So now it's a he said, she said situation. Two completely different stories, each with their own motivations and potential consequences.
It's a good reminder that right now, these are just allegations, not proven facts, so we have to be careful.
The truth often lies somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, it's rarely black and white.
Hmm.
But I have to ask, if Maddrey truly believes he didn't do anything wrong, why resign at all? Wouldn't it make more sense to fight these allegations head on?
That's a good question. Maybe it's part of some legal strategy, trying to avoid a long, drawn-out public battle. Or maybe there's something else going on that we just don't know about yet.
It's definitely a puzzling move. Either way, this whole thing really shook things up. Within the NYPD, the top brass had to scramble to try and regain control of the narrative.
Absolutely, and that's where Commissioner Tisch comes in. She had to act fast to address this whole issue of public trust, which was eroding by the minute.
She did. She immediately appointed John Schell, who was chief of patrol at the time, as the interim chief of department. A clear signal, like, hey, we're still in control here. But she didn't stop there, did she?
Nope, she also reassigned the head of internal affairs, the very department that would be investigating Maddrey. Now, this is important because internal affairs, they're supposed to be independent, right? They investigate misconduct within the police force itself.
So it's like the police policing themselves.
Exactly. So by reassigning the leader of internal affairs, Tish is basically saying, look, this investigation is going to be impartial. There are no conflicts of interest here.
It's a strategic move, for sure. showing that she understands how serious this whole thing is
Mm.
and that the public needs to see a transparent process.
But it still begs the question, is it enough to actually restore that trust? Especially when you consider that this wasn't Maddrey's first run-in with controversy, you know?
And that's where things get even more complicated because now you have Mayor Adams, a known friend and supporter of Maddrey, caught in the middle of this whole mess.
Adams had stood by Maddrey, through some tough times in the past, other controversies and stuff. And this latest scandal, well, it kind of forced him to face some tough questions about, his judgment was his loyalty to a friend clouding his ability to be objective, especially when it comes to someone in such an important position.
It definitely raised some eyebrows, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, critics were quick to jump on this and point out that Maddrey already had, a history of disciplinary issues.
Yeah, not exactly a clean record.
Right. There were allegations of excessive force, improper conduct, that kind of thing. So it made people wonder if maybe Adams was kind of turning a blind eye to all these red flags because of their personal connection.
It's a classic dilemma, isn't it? When personal relationships and professional responsibilities collide, it can be really tricky, especially in public office. Makes you think, are those in power really held to the same standards as everyone else?
It's a good question. And the way they respond in these situations, it can either build trust or completely destroy it.
Yeah, actions speak louder than words.
So how did Adams handle this whole mess?
Well, he knew he had to do something, and fast. Not only to address the specific allegations against Maddrey, but also to show that he was serious about tackling this whole issue of misconduct, making sure it doesn't happen again.
So he had to act decisively.
Exactly. And that's when he announced this big crackdown on overtime abuse across the board, all city agencies, including the NYPD.
Oh, yeah, now I remember reading about that. Big policy changes, right?
Big time. From now on, there are going to be monthly reviews of anyone who's racking up a lot of overtime. And get this, even the police commissioner has to personally sign off on these overtime reports every quarter. That's a pretty big deal, right?
Huge. It's like Adams is saying, look, we're watching. We're not messing around anymore. But it also makes me wonder, is it really enough? I mean, are these changes just for show, a knee-jerk reaction to a scandal? Or are they really going to create some lasting change?
That's the million-dollar question. Some people might say that these new policies are just damage control, a way for Adams to look like he's doing something without actually addressing the root of the problem, the culture within the NYPD that allowed this to happen in the first place.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, it's easy to make new rules, but if the culture itself doesn't change, these rules are basically meaningless.
Exactly. True reform requires more than just words on paper. You got to change the mindset. Create a system where transparency and accountability are valued at every level. A system where officers feel safe to report misconduct without being afraid of what will happen to them, and where the people in charge prioritize doing the right thing over protecting their own.
And that brings us right back to this whole question of trust, doesn't it? When someone like Maddrey, the top cop in the NYPD, gets accused of abusing his power, it sends shockwaves through the entire system. Makes people wonder, can we really rely on the police to protect us, to be fair and just, to be the guardians of justice they're supposed to be?
Absolutely. And when that trust starts to crumble, the consequences can be devastating. People might be less likely to report crimes, which means more criminals get away with it. The relationship between the police and the communities they serve becomes strained, filled with suspicion and hostility.
So then how do we even begin to repair that damage? Is it even possible after something like this? It feels like such a huge undertaking.
It's definitely not going to be easy, but it's absolutely crucial if we want to live in a society where everyone feels safe and protected. And it's going to take a multifaceted approach, a combination of concrete actions, and a genuine commitment to changing the culture from the inside out.
Okay, so let's talk about those concrete actions. What can the NYPD actually do to show they're serious about fixing this and earning back the public's trust?
I think the first thing, the most important thing, is a thorough investigation into these Maddrey allegations. And it has to be impartial. No favoritism, no sweeping things under the rug, and whatever the findings are, they need to be made public, total transparency.
Yeah, that makes sense. People need to see that the system actually works, that nobody's above the law, not even the top brass, but like we were saying, it can't just stop there. Right? We need to look beyond this one case, this one guy, and focus on those bigger systemic changes that would prevent something like this from happening again in the future.
Absolutely. Got to fix the system itself, right? So I think a good place to start would be a complete overhaul of how the NYPD handles overtime. close those loopholes that allow for abuse, and they definitely need clear guidelines, crystal clear, about what's appropriate and what's not when it comes to relationships between superiors and their subordinates, and mandatory ethics training for all officers.
Ethics training. Really? You mean like, don't use your position to pressure someone into a relationship? I mean, shouldn't that be obvious?
Yeah, you'd think so, right? But power can be intoxicating, and sometimes people need those clear boundaries, those ethical guidelines, yes, to reinforce what should be common sense. And it's about creating that culture where everybody understands their responsibilities, where they know what's at stake if they cross those lines.
I see what you're saying. But you also mentioned this idea of cultural change earlier. And that's what really sticks with me. How do you actually change the culture of a place like the NYPD, an institution that's so massive, so deeply ingrained?
It's a huge challenge, no doubt about it. But it has to start at the top, right? Commissioner Tisch, Mayor Adams, they need to set the tone, show everyone that they have zero tolerance for misconduct, and that they're serious about transparency and accountability.
Lead by example.
Exactly. And it's not just about words. They have to actually walk the walk, you know? And that includes creating a system where officers can report misconduct without being afraid of retaliation.
Protect those whistleblowers.
Yeah, those who are brave enough to speak up need to know they'll be protected, and there needs to be a clear process for investigating those complaints fairly.
So it's like starting over, building that trust back up from scratch.
That's a good way to put it. And it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time, a lot of effort, and it's going to require both the NYPD and the communities they serve to work together.
It's not an us versus them situation. Everyone needs to be on the same page.
Absolutely. Public safety, it's a shared responsibility, and it starts with those relationships, building those bridges based on mutual respect and a common goal, creating a safer, more just society for everyone.
And that brings us back to that bigger issue of trust and authority, doesn't it? It's interesting, this whole Maddrey scandal, which is one example, but it feels like we're seeing this growing distrust of institutions, of those in power, across the board.
Yeah, I see that too.
Whether it's government officials, corporate CEOs, even religious leaders, there's this feeling like those in charge, they're looking out for themselves, not for the people they're supposed to be serving.
It's definitely a trend, this heightened skepticism, and I think it's fueled by all the scandals we see, all the misinformation out there, and this growing awareness that the system isn't always fair, that there are these deep inequalities built into it.
So where do we go from here? How do we rebuild trust in a system that often feels rigged against us?
It's the question of our time, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. It's going to require us all to be more engaged, to hold our leaders accountable, and to demand transparency and ethical behavior from those in positions of power we've got to participate in our democracy, make our voices heard, and work together to create a more just and equitable world.
This deep dive, it's been quite a journey. It started with this one scandal, but it's really made me think about power, about trust, about accountability in a way I hadn't before.
And that's what these conversations are all about, aren't they? Pushing us to confront uncomfortable truths, to grapple with those tough questions, and to consider our own roles in shaping a better future.
A lot to process for sure, but it's definitely given me a lot to think about. So to our listeners out there, we'll leave you with this. The Maddrey case, it's still ongoing, but it's a powerful reminder that trust in authority, it's a delicate thing. It can be broken easily. So we need to be vigilant. We need to hold those in power accountable. And we need to create a world where trust isn't a privilege, it's a right.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better tomorrow.